Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkshire, host, and our guest is David Engerman, who is Leitner International Interdisciplinary Professor of History at Yale. He is a scholar of 20th century international history and has written 2 books on the place of Russia and the USSR in American intellectual and political life, the first being Modernization from the Other Shore, American Intellectuals and the Romance of Russian Development, and the second one is Know Your Enemy, The Rise and Fall of America's Soviet Experts. Today we'll talk with Professor Engerman about his book, The Price of Aid, The Economic Cold War in India. Welcome, Professor Engerman.
Thank you.
So let's begin with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
So the book looks at American and Soviet economic and military aid in post-colonial India from independence in 1947 for about 3 decades through the 1970s. And I'm particularly interested in the way the Cold War was fought with economic weapons there. So various forms of economic aid and a little bit on military aid as well.
Mm-hmm. So it's a bit of a departure from, I guess, your normal work with Russia and the USSR. And I'm wondering what led you to it.
Well, I don't know if that was my normal work or my first work,
okay.
in that I was always interested in histories of development and development aid.
Okay.
And the same year, in fact, that my first book came out, which was based on my dissertation, I also co-edited a collection on called Staging Growth about modernization and development programs overseas. Mm-hmm. So this is finally bringing to fruition something that had been a long-standing interest of mine.
Okay, great. And how did you do the research for the book?
The research involved a lot of travel. It was a trilateral project, so I spent a lot of time in New Delhi, in Moscow, working in archives there, and then around the United States, a lot at the National Archives in Washington, mm-hmm. and then all the presidential libraries from Truman to Ford. So that was in Independence, Missouri, Abilene, Kansas, home in Boston, where I was at the time, Austin, Texas, mm-hmm. Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Yorba Linda, California.
Wow, that is a lot of travel.
I got a lot
actually.
of frequent flyer miles.
Yeah, good for you. So let's talk about some of the findings in your book.
So one of the things that was most striking to me about the book was, in some sense, both the similarities and the differences between American and Soviet aid programs. Both had very strong ideological commitments, and yet both acted very much in kind of practical terms. So that was the first part that surprised me. The other sort of finding that I was most interested in was the way that these aid programs, which were designed to stabilize economies, to help ensure political stability, ultimately actually eroded political capacities in recipient countries like India, that it made it actually harder to govern and to set policy in India by the very virtue and the form of that the aid took.
Can you cite any specific examples?
Well, what ended up happening is that we saw internal disputes within India about visions for India's economic future that started using the superpowers for resources to help fight internal battles. And so what would happen is that you'd have these America lobbies and Soviet lobbies working in New Delhi, working with their respective superpower counterparts in a way that took some of the power away from the Indian cabinet, the Indian Planning Commission, the bodies that were actually charged with setting the overall course of Indian economic policy.
Mm-hmm. So did you notice any change over time?
Yes, I think there was change over time. I think one of the first ways we see that is there was a great deal of enthusiasm for the Soviet vision of economic planning, of heavy industry, not just in India, but actually around the world in the 1950s. Its growth rate was actually much higher than American growth and had a real enthusiasm found real enthusiasm across the post-colonial world. And that began to fade as the Soviet economy began to slow in the 1960s. So that's one element. I think another important element was the transition of power in India. So Jawaharlal Nehru was the founding prime minister of India and the sort of core political force from 1947 until his death in 1964. And in the aftermath, it changed the way politics operated. By the time his daughter Indira Gandhi becomes prime minister in the mid-1960s, there's definitely a different way of operating. The Planning Commission is less important. And there's a little bit more interest in particular kinds of Soviet programs, including and perhaps especially Soviet military aid.
Okay. And what are some of the ways that superpowers use foreign aid as a tool of the Cold War?
Well, Jawaharlal Nehru was always obsessed about this question. He insisted that aid be given with, as he put it, no strings attached. But there were always strings. And so the strings amounted to economic concerns, so that American aid, for instance, could, to the extent that foreign purchases were made, they should be made from American companies. Soviets worked actually in a parallel sort of way. But in a larger sense, the strings attached were by supporting certain kinds of projects. And so in terms of in heavy industry, which was a really important element in Indian development, there was a really strong pull toward working with the Soviets, who had a vision of heavy industry under public ownership, whereas American government resisted public ownership for heavy industry. And then in issues like food, Americans provided substantial food aid, which was actually mostly a way to get agricultural surpluses out of the Midwest before they depressed American food prices, agricultural prices. And those also had great strings attached to it about the ways that they could be used, the frequency
Like what?
with they were dispatched. Well, it was used in the mid-1960s amid some very poor harvests, actually, in India, to really push hard for what came to be called the Green Revolution, sort of capital-intensive agriculture that relied heavily on fertilizer, American fertilizer, not coincidentally. And the aid was actually dispersed in a way that was meant to ensure that steps were being taken toward the Green Revolution. President Lyndon Johnson also tried to use the aid to try and keep Indian criticisms of American foreign policy, especially as American commitment to Vietnam deepened, to try and temper official Indian criticism, although he was not entirely successful on that score.
Did you look at Britain or the UK in your research at all?
That's a good question. I did, and I didn't mention. I can mention this. I spent a lot of time in London as well for this research. And what's striking about it is that Britain is never in the position to send as much money or food or supplies or military equipment as the United States. And so the initial inclination for Anglo-American policy toward India is to have India take care of it in the late 40s and early 50s. But by the mid-1950s, it's clear that the main thrust of Western aid would be directed first and foremost by the Americans, and the British were more or less junior partners. This was particularly visible in the military, where Britain was the largest military supplier for India through the 1950s and into the 1960s. And the U.S. essentially took that over for a brief moment, but ultimately the Soviet Union became the largest supplier, and in fact is still the largest military supplier for India. Russia is obviously the largest military supplier for India to this day.
Right. Okay. So what do you conclude in your book, and ultimately what would you like the reader to take away from it?
Well, ultimately, the pursuit of aid, the prospect of providing aid, which was done for the purposes, from the superpower perspective, for the purposes of building a more stable political world and one more inclined to their own vision, often backfired. That the aid made it harder for Indian policymakers to keep to kind of a single organized structure. It ultimately weakened the political capacities in India in a way that it contributed, wasn't the only factor, but contributed to the political turmoil of the early 1970s, which culminated in Indira Gandhi's declaration of an emergency for about 18 months, 2 years in the mid-1970s. So that, be careful what you ask for in this. And I guess the other element I'd say is that while the superpowers were very busy using development as a Cold War weapon to try and win friends and influence people, that it actually played very, very differently in recipient countries like India. That in India, in fact, the Cold War was a development weapon. It was a way for different groups to assert and try and find support for their own economic visions for India's future.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you.
For more information about Professor Engerman and his research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.